Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, the Court of Appeal has ruled that the Home Secretary's decision to ban Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation was lawful. So the ban is upheld. I'll be speaking shortly to co-founder of Palestine Action, Huda Ammori. Also on the show, the US and Iran have reached a peace deal, or a ceasefire deal, somewhere in between a ceasefire deal and a peace deal. I'll speak to an expert to explain exactly what's happened. And Keir Starmer has banned social media for under 16s. I'll be discussing that with Ash Sarkar, who is my co-host this evening. We're both fairly anti-phones, aren't we, really?
Yeah, every time I open X on my phone, I feel like I'm smoking a cigarette, except it's somehow worse for me.
Yep. I would say we're going to debate it, but we're very anti-social media, so we kind of agree to some extent. Maybe we'll talk about the practicalities of it, because there are lots of people saying that even if in principle one should support it, it's unworkable. So we'll have a discussion there. Also, give us, for balance, give us your opinions. If you are fundamentally against the social media ban for under 16s, do send some comments. And I suppose I'll ask Stephen to specifically collect some objections to the social media ban that we can respond to when we get to that part of the show. And before we get started on our stories, though, tonight, a reminder that tickets are still available for our next Downstream IRL event. One of the world's most influential economists, Mariana Mazzucato, is coming to Earth Theatre in Hackney next Monday. Ash, tell us all about it.
So, unless you've been living under a rock recently, you should know that Mariana Mazzucato has a new book out called The Common Good Economy. And this offers a set of policy suggestions and provocations which seek to sort of upend the consensus around how you run economies in the 21st century. And the reason why I think this is such an interesting event is not only am I going to be there, but we're going to have John McDonnell there as well. It's going to be a few days after that critical Makerfield by-election. Andy Burnham will have won or lost. Either way, that's going to be hugely significant for the Labour Party. And thinking about Mariana's book as being in conversation with the possible direction for the Labour Party in the next couple of years, I think is something that's really critical. Now, I personally also have some ways in which I want to push the ideas. Personally, I think that many of these books which have their, here's the programme I would like to have, they often ignore some of the historic dimensions. You can have social democracy when you have actually existing communism to discipline Western capitalist states, etc., etc. But I think it will be a really interesting conversation. You can get tickets at DICE. It will be at Earth Hackney on Monday from 7 p.m. Be there. Buy me a drink. I work hard for my money.
Fantastic. And buy Ash a drink. That's a fundamental message from tonight's show. Earlier this year, a judicial review found that then Home Secretary Yvette Cooper had acted unlawfully when she prescribed Palestine Action as a terror group. Now, after that decision, the government immediately appealed. And this morning, the 5-judge panel on the Court of Appeal delivered its decision at the Royal Court of Justice.
We have had to balance the free speech and freedom of assembly rights of individuals against the rights of third parties and the national security of the communities of the UK. We have done so by applying well-established legal principles, allowing the appropriate latitude to the decision that Parliament entrusted the Home Secretary to make. The Home Secretary had both the institutional competence and the democratic accountability to make that decision. The prescription decision was not unlawful. We set aside the quashing order of the 25th of February 2026 made by the Divisional Court.
The Court of Appeal has decided that Yvette Cooper's decision was in fact lawful, and the ban on Palestine Action is now upheld. So on what grounds did the Court of Appeal disagree with February's ruling at the Divisional Court? It can be confusing in these cases, because if you think there's just one interpretation of the law, then you can say, how did these two sets of judges so radically disagree? Well, first, in February, the judicial review found that the Home Secretary, so Yvette Cooper, hadn't followed her own prescription policies when she banned Palestine Action. The judgment there was to say that Yvette Cooper had used operational justifications for the ban when she shouldn't have. So in short, Cooper said the ban was justified because it would allow the police to disrupt Palestine Action's activities. So she said, it's a good idea because the effects will be helpful to us. The judicial review, though, back then, in February, found that that was faulty reasoning because the effects of a ban should not impinge on whether the ban was a good idea in the first place, whether or not it was, in fact, a terrorist organisation. That was their judgment. The Court of Appeal today, though, disagreed.
In our judgment, the purpose of the prescription policy was not to limit or constrain the discretion of the Home Secretary. The other factors that the Home Secretary was entitled to take into account included the operational benefits of prescription in the particular case that she was considering. The Divisional Court was wrong to consider otherwise and adopted an excessively analytical approach to the interpretation of the prescription policy.
Very interesting, this idea that they adopted an excessively analytical approach. They're saying they were reading it too closely. They should have been a bit more loose with what the law says, which is sort of a surprising thing for a set of judges to say, but there we are. The second reason the Divisional Court in February ruled that the ban on Palestine Action was unlawful was because they judged it was not proportionate given the chilling effect it would have on people's freedom of expression and assembly protected under sections 10 and 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So that was the decision in February that overturned the ban. So what happened today? Well, today in the Court of Appeal, the judges ruled or accepted the ban would have a chilling effect on a group of people likely to be significant in number, namely those who wanted to protest legally but who worried they might be breaking the law. However, the court today said that that wasn't enough to overturn the ban.
We looked afresh at all the materials available to the Home Secretary, both closed and open, affording a due margin of appreciation to her own decision. We were satisfied that the prescription decision was a justified and proportionate interference with individual rights. We emphasised that the prescription decision was not merely a judgment based on Palestine Action's past activities. It involved an assessment of future risk to national security if Palestine Action was not prescribed. A pattern of escalating behaviour was obviously highly material. In this context, we noted that the Home Secretary took the ultimate decision to prescribe on the same day as and after the Bryce Norton incident, when Palestine Action activists broke into RAF Bryce Norton and damaged 2 military planes. This was a serious incident in evidencing the escalation of Palestine Action's activities, threatening national security and violating the rights of third parties. When the severity of the effects of prescription on the rights of individuals are balanced against the importance of the objectives of protecting national security and the rights and freedoms of others, affording an appropriate margin of appreciation to the Home Secretary's decision, we found that the latter, in this case, outweighed the former.
So that was a real key part of the decision. So if you listen to the whole thing, that's sort of what she spends most of the time talking about. So they say the judicial review that happened in February, they didn't properly take account the trajectory of Palestine actions. They just looked at what they'd already done. And then the big thing they kept saying is that Yvette Cooper is the Home Secretary and we should give her the benefit of the doubt, basically. She's in the best place to make the judgment, and the court was wrong to think that they didn't give enough weight to that, basically. So let's see, though, how the opponents of the ban will respond. So I'm joined now by Palestine Action's co-founder, Huda Ammori. Let's begin by getting your response to the ruling today.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's disappointing, but I don't think we can be in despair. We have to continue to fight this. Our rights and freedoms are not easily won, as history has proven. We know we are up against it. We know we're up against a system which is highly politicized, which has, lots of lobbying from the Israeli weapons industry, which is what led to this point in the first place. But at the same time, the movement against this ban and for the Palestinian people is only going from strength to strength. And that is what we need to keep growing and acting in resistance to it. It's a setback, but this is not the end result. We're going to take this the whole way to the European Court of Human Rights. But we can't just rely on the legal system. The legal system completely stitched up the Fulton defendants where they couldn't even defend themselves against a real accusation against them, which was terrorism. They were on trial for charges of criminal damage and even banned from defending themselves against that charge. They couldn't talk about their motivations. They couldn't explain why they took action, but the judge used it as a way to sentence them as terrorists. The legal system is being weaponized to attack our movement, and we all need to stand up against that.
When you say, we can't just rely on the legal system, I suppose, what does that mean in practice?
Yeah, well, I mean, Defend Our Juries has been doing a brilliant civil disobedience campaign against this. That is only going to go from strength to strength. I believe that they are planning to escalate their campaign, but it means everyone standing up against this in one way or another, whether that's through publicly speaking out against it, whether it's through civil disobedience, or whether it's through taking direct action against Albert Systems through other means. They banned Palestine Action. That doesn't mean all direct action is now terrorism. People can still take action. I believe there have been actions going on since the ban against Albert Systems and other companies arming Israel. But we can't let this be a moment where we sit in despair and give in. Whenever there is repression, there is always greater resistance, and that is ultimately how we're going to win in the end. It's completely politicized, this case, because the truth is, and I'm not just saying it because I'm the claimant, trust me, we have a solid case. We are right in the law. And I believe at one point or another, we'll get to the point where sanity prevails and we do win, but we can't let our eyes get off the ball, and we have to just keep going in our different ways to oppose the general use of terrorism legislation against protesters, because it's just increasing at this point.
Just talk to me in very concrete terms, what happens next? So do you try and take this to the Supreme Court, or is it straight to the European Court of Justice? What will you be doing now?
Yeah, so within the next few days, we'll be applying for permission to appeal to the Supreme Court, and we'll take it to the Supreme Court. After that, or if that avenue is ruled out, then we go straight to the European Court of Human Rights. But there's no doubt we're going to take this the whole way to the European Court of Human Rights, where it's likely that we will most definitely win at that point. We have a very strong case about how disproportionate this is with free speech and with the right to protest. And a lot of errors were made in this judgment that was made by the Court of Appeal, and it was highly politicized. The mention of the suffragettes, I think, was just laughable. I don't understand why they had to make that connection. It wasn't necessary, but to make that connection and get the history so wrong. There are a lot of errors within their judgment, which we can definitely fight against. But the next stage is the Supreme Court. But not only is it there's this case, there is the case against the Filton sentencing, which we're waiting to hear about the next steps for that. But I believe that they will be appealing against the sentencing as terrorists in that as well.
Yeah, and talk to me, actually. I wanted to ask you about that sentencing. That was obviously on Friday, just 3 days ago. Have you spoken to the people there who's been sentenced to prison for, I suppose, a combined 25 years? What's the effect of that been in your circles, I suppose?
I think it's crucial to know that this has been a long time coming, ever since the arrests in August 2024, when they were arrested under the Terrorism Act. No one could talk about it because of the reporting restrictions, the contempt of court situation around it. But there was always a sense that it was going to get to this point. It was great that they actually managed to defeat the most serious charges against them. But it was clear from the very beginning that what they wanted to do, I'll go back to 2 months before the Filton action took place. We now know there was a meeting between prosecutors and police where they discussed prescribing Palestine Action. At that point, no one had been arrested under the Terrorism Act for taking direct action at all in Palestine Action. But in order to prescribe us, as I discussed in that meeting 2 months before the action, they had to prove that we were concerned in terrorism. In order to do that, they had to accuse people who took direct action of terrorist offences, But in order to get that over the line, they couldn't actually charge them with terrorism, because if a jury heard that and actually heard their defense to that, they would most likely win. So instead, they used this stitched up process where they would charge them with ordinary criminal offences. And at the retrial, it was for 4 of them, the criminal damage charge, which led to the terrorist connection, the charge which they weren't allowed to defend themselves against. They were completely gagged on trial. And so that they could get a conviction, and then the judge could sentence them as terrorists. And lo and behold, 3 days after that sentencing, they scheduled this to happen in the Court of Appeal. In terms of how they're doing, I mean, you know, it's obviously incredibly difficult, and you know, they are very strong people. I think we know that this is going to be a huge fight, but at the same time, I think there is hope that we can defeat this, and that we can defeat the use of terror charges in this case. And the knowledge that that so many people are behind them, that so many people are supporting them, that makes a huge difference when you're facing this type of repression.
Setting aside the terrorism element, which was sort of added to their charges by the judge, sort of unbeknownst to the jury, which I think is sort of outrageous to most people sort of who hear about that. The images of the activists at Filton with sledgehammers, I suppose, has done a fair amount of PR damage to Palestine Action across the general population. Is that something you're worried about, that sort of that kind of footage has made it easier to go on to oppress the rights of Palestine Action to operate?
Legally, I understand what the case is against us, and it's all about serious damage to property. The reason that they were sentenced as terrorists was purely based on the fact that they destroyed drones in that factory. Many drones, over 40 weapons in total. The whole accusation was based on the property damage. So obviously they've used edited clips from inside the factory in order to try and smear people. But this is the type of thing that we're up against. You know, if it wasn't this, it would be something else. It would be another type of smear campaign. And all of them defeated the charges of aggravated burglary, which means it was proven that they didn't go into the factory with the intent of using, of injuring anybody. And they were also acquitted of violent disorder. And even Samuel Corner, you know, it was really unfortunate what happened, but even he was acquitted of doing it with intent. So I don't think we can dwell on whatever the state are going to try and use to smear us, because, you know, they'll try and throw everything at you. But I believe that we are stronger as a movement, and that the public can see through this and understand what these people were actually doing in that factory, and not overlooking, the judge definitely overlooked this, he didn't mention it at all, the fact that they destroyed quadcopter drones, the same drones we see being used constantly in Gaza to massacre the Palestinian people. Each one of those drones would have taken dozens, if not hundreds, of lives in Palestine. And they destroyed over a dozen drones in that factory. And that is why they're being accused of being terrorists, because they acted to save lives. So, you know, the state can do what they can to smear people, but the truth is on our side, and justice is on our side.
The reference to Samuel Corner there, I'm sure most of our audience is aware. We discussed it at length on Friday, but he was the person who took part in the action, who was found guilty of grievous bodily harm for damaging, or I think fracturing, a policewoman's spine with a sledgehammer. But as you say, the jury found that it wasn't with intent, so he wasn't intending to cause that grievous bodily harm, and it sort of happened in, I suppose, the chaos and confusion of the moment. Where do you think Palestine activism goes from here? I mean, obviously, there's lots of different causes. The environment really comes to mind, in climate change, where the sort of concentration on direct action became a really big thing. So you can look at Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, where there was sort of more and more people taking part in quite disruptive activity. Then the state comes and clamps down on it. And I suppose that movement has gone into a new phase. What do you see happening when it comes to the Palestine movement in general? Do you think that now the state is clamping down so heavily on direct action, it should move to different tactics, or do you think it should sort of keep doing what it's doing?
I think the clear thing is that what this has shown us is that direct action was effective. There were hundreds of actions by Palestine Action, which led to the permanent closure of Elbit Weapons Factory, cost them hundreds of millions of pounds in losses, made Elbit lose contracts worth billions of pounds. It had such a huge impact, and that's why they had to crack down on us so much. There are still ways of taking direct action without it being deemed terrorism. That is continuing. And I believe the state has shown us exactly what works. And we can't necessarily just back down at this point. We have to understand what we're up against. But I believe that the civil disobedience campaign is only going to grow. And I believe that direct action will only grow in different forms or under different groups which are not prescribed and are able to take that type of action. And I believe that is what is necessary at this time. We can't be deterred. And that's not just a saying, it is the truth. The situation in Palestine is only worsening. Our governments are only doubling down on their complicity and their connections with the Zionist regime. And I think the ban on Palestine Action is evidence of that. But also the fact that they've had to go to these lengths to try and crush the movement shows that they are desperate.
Huda Ammori, thank you so much for joining us this evening on Novara Live. We really appreciate your time. Ash, I'm going to go to you on the politics of all of this in a second. First, though, I suppose just to bring up a few interesting things from court today. The first is this.
We recognise, too, that Palestine Action is supported by many otherwise law-abiding citizens and that it is engaged in peaceful as well as non-peaceful protest. It is nonetheless a fundamental mistake to overlook the fact that Palestine Action overtly promotes unlawful violence amounting to terrorism. It is not, as it claims, a direct action civil disobedience protest group like the suffragettes operating transparently in the open.
So the idea that the suffragettes always operated transparently in the open and never committed sort of intimidating action that could be construed as violent is just very poor history. Let's go to a description from Nick Crossley. He's Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester, researches social networks. Now, in 2012, he co-authored a paper on the suffragettes and their operational tactics. In it, he writes this about their covert conduct once the state began clamping down on them. So he writes, they sought to both avoid arrest and remain anonymous. Furthermore, when the government, keen to avoid the deaths of hunger-striking suffragettes in custody, introduced a system of releasing them under house arrest with surveillance, many of those involved either used the opportunity to escape and go on the run, or employed anti-surveillance tactics to evade police watchmen and remain active. Stories abound, for example, of suffragettes sneaking out of the houses in which they were supposed to be imprisoned in order to take part in further illegal actions or rallies. They both committed illegal acts whose details were kept secret from the authorities prior to their commission and sought to remain anonymous to all but a select few after the commission of these acts. Of course, the suffragettes were hardly non-violent either. In 1912, Mary Lee, an early member of Emmeline Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union, went to Dublin, where she threw a hatchet at the British Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith with a women's suffrage message attached. It didn't hit Asquith, but it did injure an Irish nationalist leader, and she was arrested. That wasn't even the most violent of Lee's actions, though. So in 2018, author Simon Webb wrote this to The Guardian. This is the same Mary Lee who, acting with others, poured petrol over the carpets of a crowded theatre, set fire to it, and then detonated a bomb. She and the others were later charged with causing an explosion of a nature likely to endanger life. This is precisely the same sort of charge that terrorists today might face. The women were not charged with terrorism as such because no such offence existed at the time. Other suffragettes sent mail bombs, burned down houses, and set off a bomb in Westminster Abbey. Of course, Palestine Action has done none of those things. So the Court of Appeal could do with some extra history lessons. And on the subject of arms companies, this was also said in court today.
Palestine Action's campaign was intended to close down lawful businesses. It took direct criminal action against businesses and institutions, including key national infrastructure and defence firms, providing services and supplies to support Ukraine, NATO, the Five Eyes allies, and the UK defence enterprise.
As you mentioned, all the all the popular causes that the UK military or suppliers might be involved in, they don't mention Gaza. Now, of course, the main defence company targeted by Palestine Action has been Israel's Elbit Systems, which has several sites in the UK. And so far, it seems that the government and the courts have been very keen to protect its right to do business in and profit from the UK. Now, this morning, my colleague Stephen Meffin published an article on how the Filton sentencing last week has made the distinction between direct action and terrorism wafer thin. And in it, Stephen makes this point. So he says, how quickly it's been forgotten that according to Israeli military sources, it was an Elbit 450 drone that carried out the strikes on a World Central Kitchen convoy in Gaza in April 2024. 3 vehicles were hit, one after the other, with survivors of each strike running to the next vehicle only to be struck again, until finally all 7 aid workers were killed. 3 of them were Brits. But rather than holding the company to account, not just for its part in enabling war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, but also for the murder of free British citizens, the UK government has given it cover in our own country. It has been made a revered guest, one that gets to have private chats with the CPS and successive government ministers. And he goes on, and when activists tried to do what the government would not, namely disable the possibility of it supplying weapons to a state that kills our citizens and countless others with them, our establishment sided with Elbit rather than us, rather than punish Elbit for providing the tools to blow up and burn our countrymen, 2 of them veterans no less. It's 4 young people they've punished, so it can continue to do so. After today's ruling, we saw the very familiar consequences of the government's decision to protect Elbit at all costs. Over 100 people have gathered, outside the Royal Courts of Justice, peacefully sitting on the ground while holding up signs saying, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action. Arrests soon began, with dozens of mostly elderly people carried away by the police. So far, over 700 people have been charged with terror offences related to sign holding, while nearly 3,500 people have been arrested. Despite all this chaos, current Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood was sounding pretty upbeat today, saying this: there is a difference between supporting Palestine and supporting a prescribed terrorist group. We will always take the strongest possible action to protect our national security and keep the public safe. Ash, lots to discuss here when it comes to the politics. Let's just begin on the judge. I mean, a very distinguished person. There's also 5 people on the judge's panel, and she was reading out a sort of written ruling. She wasn't just speaking off the cuff, saying that Palestine Action can't be compared to the suffragettes because they act in a covert manner and they, cause lots of property damage. Like, they need to watch a YouTube video. I feel like we learned that in GCSEs.
Well, I think this is one of the things that happens when you integrate a radical movement into your national story, which is it has to become defanged and sanitized, because otherwise that becomes a justification to things which are in conflict with the state's interests of the day. So something like the suffragettes, who I think they tried to blow up Lloyd George's house. Someone tried to throw an axe at Herbert Asquith. Many of their tactics were, by whatever definition you want to use, violent. They were disruptive. There were risks to people's lives and people's safety. And as you already explained, they also coordinated in covert manners as well. Now, had the judge, and we were talking about this earlier, something you said was, had the judge said, well, they were driven to those tactics because they didn't have the right to vote, you'd go, all right, that's an argument which makes a certain amount of sense. But for whatever reason, she didn't go down that route. Instead, it was just this complete ahistorical nonsense. And it's something which I've seen in sort of other areas of politics as well. So when Zach Polanski wore a T-shirt saying "Free Marwan Barghouti," and then you had all of Israel's advocates on the internet, and I think this was David Hirsch saying, but he was, he had a fair trial for terrorism offences because, he was acquitted of some and convicted of others. So I was like, well, Nelson Mandela was acquitted of some offences, like most notably the offence of treason, I think, in 1961. He was then also imprisoned. Would you look back and go, well, Nelson Mandela was treated fairly by the apartheid state? Nelson Mandela also was, you can't question this. He was the leader of the ANC's armed wing. But because Nelson Mandela has been integrated into a particular story, which serves a political purpose, and I think it also served a political purpose for post-apartheid South Africa as well, to have him be a man of peace and, a statesman as well, is that this other thing, which is true and probably bears a closer parallel, closer relation to something that's happening in the present, that gets talked over in a way which I just think it's almost laughably ignorant. And I think that's what you see here in terms of the suffragette comparison. They really needed to put a nail in the coffin of that suffragette comparison, because those are the radicals that we talk about and we named an overground line after, right? They've become such a huge part of our story of patriotism and national identity. There are some other political aspects of this that I think would be interesting to consider, which is how would the next Labour leader, if we get one after the summer, deal with Palestine Action? So there was some polling which came out recently which suggested that as many as 53% of 2024's Labour voters have been put off voting for Labour because of Palestine. I'm not sure how much I believe that. It seems a little bit like motivated reasoning, but certainly a really significant number of Labour's voters have been put off because of the positioning around Palestine and the support for Israel. There are many people who will see elderly protesters being dragged off because they've been holding placards saying, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action, and go, that's a completely ridiculous use of police resources. No serious person looks at those people and go, oh yeah, you're an equivalent to ISIS. Oh yeah, you're an equivalent to National Action. So there's a political problem if Labour goes on down this track. And if Palestine Action go all the way to the European courts, it would present a problem for any Labour leader who is trying to bring cohesion back to Labour's progressive flank. Because what do? Right? Do you either go, all right, we're going to quietly deprescribe, or accept a sort of recommendation from a court to deprescribe Palestine Action, and then Palestine Action does what they're going to do, and they, target another Israeli weapons firm. That puts, cough, cough, Andy Burnham in like an invidious political position there. Like, what do you do? Because on the one hand, you're going to get attacked as, soft on crime, soft on protesters, blah, 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 blah. But on the other, you're going to do real damage to the electoral coalition you need to put together and keep together if you want to hope to defeat reform in 2029.
I think on my prediction on Palestine Action, he'll take the path of least resistance, which is if this does get overturned in the Supreme Court, he'll accept that judgment and sort of say, okay, the highest court in the land has said it's unlawful. Maybe it was a mistake by the previous administration. What we can do is just use, if anyone wants to smash up a weapons factory, we'll put them in prison for a long time because it's already illegal without the terrorism sort of association. I'd imagine he'd do that. I definitely don't think he's going to sort of act proactively to get rid of the Palestine Action ban. If the Supreme Court also agrees that it was lawful to do the ban, Andy Burnham is not going to poke that bear, I think. I don't know what you think.
I don't think he'll poke that bear either. Also, there is an element, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this a lot more this week, looking forward to the Makerfield by-election, is what is the sort of backroom deal that took place between Andy Burnham and Josh Simons to get Josh Simons to step down in Makerfield. So Josh Simons, obviously former director of Labour Together, that's the right wing of the Labour Party. If he thought that Andy Burnham was going to be a sort of protest-oriented left-winger, I doubt he would have stepped down in Makerfield. So that's part of the consideration as well.
2 months after an initial fragile ceasefire, the United States and Iran have agreed what seems like a slightly more long-term peace deal. Now, as usual, the announcement was first made by Donald Trump on Truth Social. So he posted, "The deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran is now complete. Congratulations to all. I hereby fully authorize the toll-free opening of the Strait of Hormuz and simultaneously herewith authorize the immediate removal of the United States naval blockade. Ships of the world, start your engines. Let the oil flow. President Donald J. Trump." Often, sort of, we've seen Donald Trump sort of come out and say a deal is about to be made or a deal has been made, it's brilliant. And then the Iranians come out and say, I'm not so sure, mate. This time, the Iranians confirmed that Trump was announcing a genuine agreement that they had also agreed to. On Monday, the Secretariat of Iran's Supreme National Security Council released this statement. Based on the approval of the Supreme National Security Council, the text of the Memorandum of Understanding regarding the end of war negotiations, the Islamabad talks between Iran and the United States, was finalized on the evening of June the 15th. Under the agreement reached, the war and military operations on all fronts, including Lebanon, are ended immediately and permanently. Furthermore, the naval blockade against Iran is terminated immediately and completely. So we have a deal. Good news. The Strait of Hormuz will be reopened. The US will end its blockade of Iranian ports. And crucially, really important that this was included in it, Israel will in theory be forced to cease its war on Lebanon. That's why Netanyahu was not very happy about all of this. What about the issues, though, which made Trump and Netanyahu claim this war was necessary in the first place, namely the enrichment of uranium by Iran? Well, the Memorandum of Understanding between the two nations is still yet to be published, but reports suggest contentious issues such as Iran's nuclear program may have been kicked into the long grass to be sort of decided or debated further down the line in negotiations. And US Vice President J.D. Vance has said there are lots of details yet to be agreed.
Well, our expectation is that the strait is going to be opened in a toll-free way for the long term, and that's the sort of thing that we're going to figure out in these technical negotiations. You know, there are a lot of very important details to figure out that we're actually going to sit at the table and discuss together and figure out a path forward on these details. For example, they've committed to destroy and dispose of their stockpile of highly enriched material. That's the highly enriched uranium that they accumulated over the Obama administration and over the Biden administration. And what we've said is, okay, let's talk about how exactly we're going to do that. They want access to an unsanctioned economy. We've talked about, okay, we're open to that, but that would require a long-term commitment to the inspection and verification regime that I just talked about. So a lot of these details are going to be figured out during those 60-day talks. We feel quite confident that we're in a strong position here. Fundamentally, we have the leverage. We have the diplomatic, economic, and military leverage, but we also are extending an open hand to the Iranians and saying, if you guys negotiate in good faith and you make that long-term commitment not to develop nuclear weapons, then we are going to make sure that your country is successful. If, however, you refuse to meet us halfway, then we're going to continue to apply the pressure that we've seen build up economically in particular, and that's going to be bad for them, and fundamentally, it's going to be bad for the region.
So that was J.D. Vance sounding a lot like the Trump administration is willing to agree to something along the lines of Obama's nuclear deal, which Donald Trump ripped up in his first term. Now, one might also question whether J.D. Vance is correct that the US still holds all the cards, considering Iran can still close the Strait of Hormuz as and when it pleases. However, when we move beyond American cope, is this a deal we should welcome? Well, I spoke earlier today to Esfandyar Batmanghelidj, CEO of Bourse Bazaar. We've had him on the show before, brilliant guest. That's a think tank promoting peace and economic development in West Asia.
I think it's good news that we've gotten to this point. The crisis had gone on really for way too long, and it was a really dangerous moment for the region at large, because had the negotiations for this framework deal fallen apart, there was every possibility that we would have ended up back into a full-blown conflict. And so I think a lot of credit goes to the regional countries that stepped in to help facilitate this deal through their mediation, through formulating ideas to bridge the gaps between the US and Iran. And I think actually that's ultimately why I am somewhat optimistic after the agreement, not so much because I think that this framework deal will really reset US-Iran relations. There's a long road ahead for further technical negotiations, and of course, a lot of issues that seem just really beyond the Trump administration's capability to address. But if you are going to look at the Middle East and think about, well, what are the factors that you need to prevent the region sliding back into a major crisis, as we saw with the war at the beginning of this year? The capacity for regional diplomacy and the ability of regional states to find a common voice in pushing for a peace deal, that's very positive. And I think hopefully it's something that can be built upon when we think about what security looks like in the Middle East in the future.
And what were the sticking points? What are the concessions that have been made by either side here? Because I suppose it's not clear how this is different from just a sort of bog standard ceasefire. What are the sort of concrete things which have been agreed here that we didn't see 2 months ago?
Michael, the thing is that a lot of the terms of the agreement feel quite standard, or they feel like things we've seen before. I mean, you've already had critics of this peace deal going after the Trump administration for agreeing to a deal that looks a lot like the Iran nuclear agreement in terms of the way in which it balances Iranian concessions on its nuclear program with American concessions around sanctions relief. But there's a reason for this, because the challenge of a US-Iran deal has not principally been one of the technical parameters of getting the two sides to find some way of a win-win formula, basically, to come out of this cycle of conflict. The challenge has always been a political one, and the concrete kind of steps that we see in this framework agreement, for example, the fact that it seems that after the Israeli strikes on Lebanon, just on the eve of the signing of the agreement, the Trump administration agreed that rather than in a slow and incremental fashion removing the blockade of Iran, the naval blockade, it would instead immediately remove the blockade as a confidence-building measure for the Iranian side, keep them engaged in the agreement. What that demonstrates is that ultimately this is about the two sides showing the political will for the leadership to put together a deal that ultimately has a lot of critics, both in Tehran and in Washington. I mean, we've seen in the last few days vocal criticism of the deal from hardliners in Tehran. We've seen vocal criticism of the deal from what we can call hardliners in Washington. And so ultimately, I think what will make or break this deal is whether or not the Trump administration and the current Iranian leadership have the resolve to keep going with the diplomacy, even though there will be aspects of the negotiated agreement, those technical terms that are politically unpopular or seen as maybe too great of a concession, given the optics around this kind of US-Iran diplomacy.
And you've said there that Trump is being criticized by some on the right in America, or hawkish people in America, for signing up to something that looks a bit more like the Obama nuclear deal. Now, my understanding was that this current memorandum of understanding, although it hasn't been published yet, doesn't really deal with the nuclear issue, and that all gets kicked into the long grass. But I don't know, do you have a different... Is there something more concrete in this deal about nuclear enrichment than I'm sort of giving it credit for?
Michael, you're right that the MOU itself, this framework deal, doesn't specifically obligate steps for Iran to take in terms of eliminating its stockpile of highly enriched uranium or providing verification or monitoring access around its nuclear program. But the idea of the MOU is that it establishes the framework for further negotiations on those issues. And I think here is an aspect of this deal that is somewhat innovative. The challenge of nuclear diplomacy between the US and Iran had always been that after the withdrawal of the US from the nuclear deal in 2018, in the first Trump term, there was a problem of credibility. How could Iran undertake complex negotiations with the US and decide a whole host of mutual obligations in terms of the sequencing of nuclear concessions with economic concessions, and trust that at the end of that complex negotiations, the deal that was agreed would actually be implemented? And in some ways, I think that the MOU is a smart approach, because what it does is it establishes the principles for the negotiations that are set to take place. And here, for example, we heard today the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson talking about the fact that the MOU, in his language, in a sense, obligates the US to pursue the complete lifting of sanctions on Iran. Now, does that mean that the MOU itself triggers the complete lifting of sanctions? No, but it establishes the expectation that if Iran were to undertake a certain series of steps with regards to its nuclear program, it could reasonably expect that the US would take steps on its side, leading to broad sanctions relief. So it creates a kind of a way in which the two sides can build confidence incrementally in the course of negotiations. I think that's novel, and I think that has some potential of dealing with the credibility problem inherent around negotiations with Trump. That being said, I do feel that we should be skeptical that this framework deal will lead to a comprehensive agreement, because we haven't really seen a strong aptitude in the Trump administration for going from kind of these phase one diplomatic deals to larger and more comprehensive diplomatic understandings in other arenas in which they've engaged in high-level diplomacy.
I want to talk about what we've learned about the global economy over the past 4 months, because it's been basically 4 months now that the Strait of Hormuz has been largely closed. There were, at the start of this war, lots of people, when Iran initially closed the Strait of Hormuz, saying, we're set for $200 a barrel oil. The fertilizer blockage means that there's going to be sort of catastrophic crop failures. And I suppose from my perspective, admittedly not sort of following this very closely over the past few weeks, for the last 2 months, everyone seems to have forgotten about the Iran war. Oil has been under $100 for a while now, for weeks. Is the global economy in a way more resilient than many people had given it credit for when it comes to a crunch point like this?
On one hand, yes. I think what you can see is that not unlike in other cases where there's a sort of exogenous shock to the global economy, maybe COVID being another example, markets and economic operators, they find a way of keeping things kind of ticking along. They find alternatives and they pursue redundancies, and that's how they're able to basically deal with something like a critical energy choke point being closed for the better part of 4 months. On the other hand, I think we've sort of gotten lucky in that we did not see more profound economic shockwaves as a result of this war. And I don't think it is a surprise that the negotiations culminated in a framework agreement at this precise moment. As the summer was dragging on, we were approaching a point at which the ability of markets to kind of price in a resolution for this crisis and therefore keep the prices of certain commodities in a reasonable range, like the price of oil, was going to hit the reality of physical disruptions having gone on for so long that it was untenable that we wouldn't see more dramatic impacts in the global economy. I mean, some analysts have pointed to really quite unique and somewhat unexpected dynamics where, for example, China, because it had developed this really enormous strategic stockpile of crude oil, was able to dramatically reduce its imports in the last couple months, which ultimately alleviated pressure on the global oil market while the Strait of Hormuz remained closed. At some point, China, like many other countries, was going to draw down its reserves and would need to tap the markets again in a more significant way, and that would have necessarily driven up the price of oil. So, I think there are those who maybe were skeptics of the idea that economic pressure was going to play a role in the resolution of this conflict. They might look at this moment and say that they were right ultimately, that we didn't see $200 for a barrel of oil. But at the same time, I think at the end of the day, if you look at the actual dynamics that were emerging and the way that pressure was mounting, those stopgap solutions were going to fail at some point. And that probably did factor into the mentality of the Trump administration in thinking, you know what, we actually need to get this deal over the line. And there's a reason why our regional allies are pushing us to do so. They're at the coalface here, and they see the chaos that is going to hit the markets if they don't get their oil moving very soon.
That was Esfandyar Batmanghelidj speaking to me earlier today. Keir Starmer probably doesn't have much time left in office, so he's in a mad rush to try to build a legacy. And part of that, he hopes, will be to save children from smartphone screens.
The response from parents in the consultation has been absolutely clear. Thousands of parents say their children are addicted to social media. It can leave them trapped in a cycle of endless scrolling that displaces play, sleep, and time with the family. It can harm their mental health. And frankly, parents need our support on this. That is why today, the government has decided to ban social media access for children under 16.
The ban, which Starmer says should come into effect by next spring, will require apps like Snapchat, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and X to age verify users and to freeze the accounts of anyone below the age of 16. So that'd be the mechanism. Starmer accepted, though, that evasion would still likely be possible.
Will it mean that no child ever logs onto social media again? No. But look, this might shock you, but it doesn't shock parents of teenagers. They get around other laws too. But we don't say, oh, look, a teenager managed to get a drink somehow, so let's not bother banning alcohol sales to children. We don't do that, do we? That would be utterly ridiculous. And so I just don't accept that argument. Laws are rules, but they're also an expression of our values. They shape the social contract. And so this will change the conversations that parents have and the expectations of children over time.
Now, I don't say this so much on the show, but I totally agree with Keir Starmer. I think the ban is justified, and I also think that when people say it will be evaded, I think it's absolutely right to say just because some evasion will happen doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I think probably the ban will happen. It will work out that lots of people will be evading it, and you'll gradually shift the mechanism so that fewer and fewer people are able to do it. But also the most important thing is changing the norm, right? At the moment, young people expect that they will be spending 4 hours a day, at least, on social media. I think we need to end that expectation because it's been a disaster. I'll talk about that with Ash at length in a moment. First of all, though, let's get, we're quite old here. So let's get the perspective. We're fairly old, Ash. Let's get the perspective of a young person, a bona fide young person. There isn't decent polling of people under 16, so we don't sort of know the whole proportions of what people believe. But the BBC's straw poll in a school this morning did come back with an overwhelming result.
Will you please put your hands up, those of you who welcome the ban. Hands up for those who welcome the ban. So this just gives you an idea. I think it's pretty fair to say that most of these students there, 11 to 14, most are pretty disappointed with the ban. Let's just come over to you, Isabella. Tell me how you felt when you heard the Prime Minister say no more social media for you.
I didn't think it would actually happen. I kind of believed that he'd chicken out of it and give it more time or more consideration, but he seems pretty sure of it, and I'm not sure if I agree with him.
What are you most worried about?
Not being able to contact my friends. I don't know what will happen and how it will happen, or whether if there's some technicalities to what apps are restricted, but I use most of my social media to contact my parents and family.
I mean, I think it's worth reminding people, earlier we looked at screen time. What was your screen time over the weekend?
9 hours.
9 hours. So suddenly you're going to have a lot more time to fill. And what will you do?
Stare at a wall.
Now, there is an argument that gets made about social media, and I'm probably guilty of this sometimes, which is to say that social media has sort of ruined the social intelligence of young people. They're not articulate anymore because TikTok has melted their brains. Now, that is a girl who spends 9 hours over a weekend at her screen, and she's clearly very articulate, very funny, very good at putting forward her position. Lots of people sort of debating online, is she seriously not sure how she's going to fill the 9 hours, or was she just like a very witty person for her age? Obviously, on a serious level, I think being bored is good for you to an extent. And I'm really excited about what that girl might fill that 9 hours with. I know she's a bit pissed off about it at the time. But I think that someone of that age spending 9 hours on their phone over the weekend is not ideal. We know that the mental health of young people is not very good. People are meeting in real life much less than they used to. They're drinking less. Sort of to go back to what Keir Starmer said, I think actually kids could do with, not kids, but for me, when I was 16 and 17, going and sort of having
you'd get your bottle of Frosty Jacks.
Yeah, that was important for my social development. I think the idea, if I was just at home instead, like scrolling through TikTok and messaging people, I don't think that would have been good for my development. Anyway, Ash, your response to the ban.
Okay, I mean, first, it's a miracle that you've got me talking at all so close to the grave. I am, according to you. I actually agree with this. I'm not saying it's perfect, and I think there are some elements of the mechanism to be worried about. The normalization of digital ID is, I think, something to worry about, especially when you go, there's going to be all these third-party identification apps being used where it's like, hey, where is my data going? All right, there are things that I think you're right to be worried about. But when it comes down to it, social media is designed to be addictive. Infinite scroll is designed to be addictive in a way which bypasses user awareness. And we see the effect that it has on us who are adults, and also we weren't born to it. So I remember the sound of a dial-up modem, right? I remember when you couldn't be on the phone at the same time as using the internet. I remember what it was like to use MySpace and Facebook at first. I remember what social media was like before Infinite Scroll. And so even though all these things entered my life later in my development, I am still an addict to individualized screens. I find it difficult sometimes to just participate in everyday life, and I start to feel anxious or weird and not present, and I use one of these screens to self-soothe. And I know that I'm not alone in that. When I think about my mum and her relationship to WhatsApp, I mean, look, she's a South Asian lady of a certain age, of course she's addicted to WhatsApp. It just pulls her in again and again and again, and it offers us like an infinite now, which prevents us from being present with each other. And I think that the impact it's had on people socially has been massive. So there was an FT article, I think it was in May, which said that the only thing that explains falling birth rates in every single country is the introduction of the smartphone. So it's something which pulls us away from social interaction with other people. It then weakens our ability to deal with conflict, and it also presents us with endless fantasy, which means that we're really bad at dealing with conflict. So for the first time in human history, a couple that moves in together is more likely to break up than they are to have a child. And so digital immersion is a part of that. And I'm not using the word addictive in a sort of offhand way. I don't just mean sort of spicy dependency. I mean that it's designed to do things to us that we don't fully understand about ourselves. And I think it was Richard Seymour who wrote about this in The Twittering Machine. He sort of says, well, social media resembles anything. It's like gambling. It's just, it's this thing where, we know that we're going to lose, but we keep doing it, and we can't get a grip over our own behavior. That has since taken quite a literal turn. So, the streaming platform Kick.
I don't actually.
So Kick is the one that Clavicula's really big on.
Right, okay.
Anytime you see like a Gen Z streamer and you go, oh my God, you are so bad for society, they're on Kick.
Right.
One of their biggest financial backers is Stake. So Stake is the online gambling app. Yeah. And you might have also seen that Stake sort of colonized short form video content for a while. So sort of recycled viral clips would then have the Stake branding. You can now see that with something like Kalshi, which is another sports betting and futures market, is that that's now taking over digital short form content as well. So I don't think it's the mark of a good society which allows corporations to prey as they wish to on children, and absolutely wrecking their attention span, their ability to self-soothe, their ability to deal with boredom, like all of these things. I don't think there's anything like good or left-wing about that. And there are some people I've seen who are, on the left, on Twitter, so they're addicts like me, right, in the grip of an active addiction, just like me, saying, oh, well, it's up to parents to raise their kids, use parental controls. Like, I actually think that's quite... Who do you think's more powerful, right? Your average mum or dad who has to deal with like work and pressures on their lives and all stuff like that, or like Silicon Valley billionaires who are pouring money into making sure that we can't control ourselves with these apps. So I think that there is a naivety around that, which is quite deliberate. I do think it's wrong that YouTube is included in the ban. I think short form YouTube videos should be included, but YouTube long form videos shouldn't. And it's not to say that all the content on YouTube is good, right? Obviously, there's like misogyny and great replacement stuff and yada, yada, yada. But there's a load of material on there which is genuinely not just educational, but it allows children to explore their interests.
And in case anyone thinks this is self-serving, because you're probably watching us on YouTube, Novara Media does also have a very popular Instagram account and a popular TikTok account, and we do YouTube Shorts. And they definitely should ban TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube Shorts for young people. So it's not just whatever Novara Media is on, kids should be able to watch. I think YouTube long form is different from those other. I think in general, the state could have a bigger role in sort of how social networks do algorithms. So I think it could easily be the case that we say, look, so many people are getting their sort of information from YouTube. Like when it came to sort of television networks, there was Ofcom there to decide, to suggest, I mean, they haven't been functioning very well when it comes to GB News, but sort of to put forward the idea of balance. You could say that YouTube's algorithm needs to take into account the idea of balance, so that if you've just watched a Novara Media video, you get a spectator video next. Like I'd be fine with that, right? I'm very much in favor of people getting both sides. I think people getting sort of polarized into their rabbit holes is not great. So I do think that we could have sort of regulations when it comes to YouTube and the algorithm. But I think in general, long form for kids on YouTube, not a big problem. Let's look at whether or not this can work, though. First of all, I'm going to say, even if it does, I think what's so important about this is that it is saying we don't actually have to treat technology like a force of nature, right? Even if this is a clumsy move, some people are critiquing Keir Starmer for sort of saying he's rushed this out to try and build a legacy. That's probably true. But I think just sort of putting a stake in the ground and saying technology, smartphones, social media, it's not a force of nature that we just have to sort of accept as inevitable. We as a society can say we've seen the consequences of this and we don't like it, right? So we're going to intervene. I like that. Anyway, let's have a look at how effective this has been, because of course it does need to be to some degree effective. If everyone is evading it and using social media just as much as they did before, then it would be purely symbolic, and that would be a shame. The BBC spoke to students in Australia, so they introduced a ban a few months ago, and it does actually look like that ban has had a limited impact.
I wasn't banned from Snapchat, TikTok or Instagram, and none of my friends were.
When the ban came, I got kicked off social media. It allowed me to see the clarity in how social media actually wasn't very important for my life.
I've made friendships with a lot more people who don't have it because I can relate to not having it as well.
I was not impacted by the social media ban. So I still use Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat. Of my year group, which is there is about 170 to 180 girls, I know of exactly 3 who were impacted.
I received notifications that there would be checks and that they would verify our age. However, I did not lose my account.
On TikTok, I just got a notification that said like the terms and conditions had changed. And it just said like, click OK. And I clicked that and it was A-OK.
My parents were very restrictive about social media, so I didn't have any. But I thought this ban would make it more equal because other people wouldn't have social media, but it didn't really work for a lot of people.
So what's really interesting there, for all the people, obviously it's not a very scientific poll, but all the people that the BBC spoke to there, if they had their social media banned, they actually thought the consequences were quite strong, right? They could see, oh, actually, I didn't really need it. They went and met people in real life. They could, better engage with people who also didn't use social media. But it sounds like the vast majority of young people in Australia have still been able to use it. So it's not just a case of, with booze, when you're, 16, my experience was that sort of maybe on a Saturday night, you would, someone would go to the off license with a fake ID, or you'd get an older friend to do it. And then like once a week you'd drink a bit, but you couldn't go to the shop on the way home from school and get yourself a beer, right? That was good. If this is the equivalent of banning alcohol, but then everyone being able to buy it, that would sort of be somewhat, not self-defeating, but pointless, I suppose. Interestingly, again, I started this segment by agreeing with Keir Starmer. I'm now going to do something even rarer, which is I'm going to kind of agree with Nigel Farage. This is Nigel Farage's sort of alternative to the social media ban. He said, whilst the social media ban is well-intentioned, it's unlikely to work given the mass adoption of VPN. So VPN is what you can use to sort of make it look like you're in a different country. Nigel Farage says it will also mean the introduction of digital ID via the back door. The real answer here is handsets for children with limited features. Now, Nigel Farage has been putting out a lot of very obnoxious opinions over the weekend about various things, generally sort of related to white identity politics. This idea, though, giving, what's called a dumb phone, so a phone that only has limited functions, you can text your friends, you can text your family, you can call your family. When you're out, you're contactable, which is good for safety or whatever, but that can't go on any of these social media apps, to me seems like a good idea.
The thing is that if you make it something which is just up for individual parents to do, and it's not something which is society-wide, you just end up in the same old place where there's going to be like some kids whose parents take it really seriously, other kids whose parents don't. And
unless you have the police literally stop people and say, I think you've got an iPhone, mate. Where's your ID?
But like, look, I know that we're getting cooked in the comments here, all right?
We'll go to your comments in a moment because so many of you disagree.
And look, why are you booing me? I'm right. I think that there is an element here, which is we're trying to make up for the 10 years of, infinite scroll. It's not more than 10 years now, I'm showing my age. But the, decade and a bit of infinite scroll, which had unfettered access to children to destroy their attention spans and self-esteem. And there's a certain irony that Keir Starmer's going, okay, well, what we're going to do is age gate social media, but AI, that can have free access to children, particularly in the context of learning. So I don't know if you saw that stuff about, rolling out AI tutors who are also stupid and often give the wrong answer very, very quickly. to young people. AI has hit education like a bomb, quite frankly. It's made take-home assignments completely useless. And what that means in terms of being able to develop critical analytical faculties is actually really worrying. And that's happening at every level of education, from school right the way up through university. So I think that there is a bit of trying to, bolt the stable door here after the horse is bolted. But like, you're at the same time giving sort of unrestricted, unfettered access to another, incredibly predatory form of Silicon Valley capital. But I do just think it comes back down to this thing, which is, I think that the people who are in the comments need to justify how you expect teenagers and their parents to be more powerful and more in possession of self-control than Silicon Valley billionaires who have literally poured infinity money into making infinite scroll and social media addictive. Right. And if you can come up with a good explanation for me about how, single individuals can be more powerful than, a whole web of networked and well-resourced capital, then you can persuade me.
Okay, let's go to some objections. We said we would do this. Vicky Clee says, I'm not worried for the kids. I'm worried for every person here who doesn't want to hand over our ID to watch Novara media. I suppose that's... We'd be happy for YouTube long form to be excluded from the ban. So I suppose on one,
I think YouTube long form should be excluded from the ban.
So we on that, in that respect, we kind of agree with Vicky Clee. Inverted, although to be honest, I'm not that. I'm less worried than many people about digital ID, because I feel like so many of these sites already know who I am. I'm not that, and I think that sort of the downsides of an anonymous internet is quite severe and serious, actually, in terms of sort of like how obnoxious and how difficult it makes it, especially for women and minorities when it comes to abuse. That I'm not really opposed to an internet which is a bit more verified. I don't know, what do you think?
So I was talking to a journalist who'd written a book about, like, basically things which are modeled in different countries which work really well. So in Estonia, for instance, they do have digital ID, but the point of digital ID is that you own your data. Mm-hmm. It cannot be sold to any third party. And that is so baked into the use of this digital ID. So I'm not against digital ID in principle. I'm against the versions of digital ID in this country which are like, oh, hello, Palantir, would you like some lovely, tasty British data? So I do have concerns about age gating being a way of getting digital ID through the back door. But you have to balance that against what I think of as, like, nearly extinction level harms presented by addictive social media.
Yeah, trade-offs. Right. Inverted zero lumping YouTube in as social media is a ridiculous stretch, and it's already moderated better than the others. I mean, it is also true. It's not really social media. I suppose people would say TikTok's not really social media either, because you're just absorbing content. As I say, YouTube Shorts definitely should be included. Not necessarily. I suppose where I come from with this as well, lots of the discourse in the mainstream is often about what kids are exposed to. Do they see porn or violence or whatever? Obviously, I think that matters. I don't want kids seeing porn or violence, but I'm actually much more interested in the attention spans and the social impact it has on not meeting each other. So if people say, let's just have a safe TikTok. If they're scrolling TikTok and they're not seeing violence or sex, I still think they shouldn't be doing it, because it comes
back to that thing of, like, you can literally see when smartphones hit and its impact on demographic decline around the world. If you make being alone in your room too entertaining, I do think you're actually taking away from something that it means to be human. And I think that this is the thing, is that, humans are sophisticated beings, but I think that there are two things which are hard-coded into us. One is a desire for connection and sociability, and the other is for convenience. And what social media has done is that it gives us the illusion of infinite social connection in a way which is more convenient than going outside.
100%.
And so that's why we're so vulnerable to it, like, as a species.
And it does feel a bit like, like in those experiments where they give the rats the little sort of like dopamine hit. We've all been turned into those rats. Right, Austin Sideburns. not Austin sideburns. I don't think SM ban for under 16s is workable. I think it would be good for kids not to be so online. Social media does offer some a sense of community. I doubt investment in alternative physical spaces will come. I mean, obviously, I'm in favor of investment in physical spaces. I also do think that the causality gets that, like, if one of the reasons why physical spaces are closing down is because there's no demand to go to them. And the reason there's no demand to go to them is because everyone's on social media. So I think sort of like if you ban the social media, the physical spaces will be more likely to come. Often the physical space is often just
I'm not
public
sure.
space. Okay, go on.
I'm not sure in this country. So the thing is that there are other countries which also have social media addicted youth, but have much better use of public space. So I was recently in Barcelona to see my friend, and when
Amazing.
great city.
I've just come back from there as well.
Great city.
Yeah.
And one of the things which is really notable about Barcelona is just how much sport is played outdoors everywhere. And it's not just like tucked away in a park, right? Like it's just sort of like to the side of the main road. You've got like a big muga or like a row of basketball nets, and they're all being used. And so I do think that there is a problem here about the decline of third spaces, because that actually predates social media, flooding and saturating the lives of young people. I mean, we were growing up in the 2000s. You remember the sort of ASBO moral panic in which, 2 or more teenagers could be ordered to disperse at any time by police officers. I was recently reading about a case in Derbyshire where, because of noise complaints, a Muga, which is like the multi-use gym area, was shut down because of residents making noise complaints. So there is a real problem with the lack of third spaces. 760 youth centres have been closed down since 2010. That really matters. So I don't think that if you create the spaces, kids will just come, because, like I said, like social media is too convenient and too addictive. But you have to have both.
Yeah. Right, someone who agrees with us, Dalian Haynes. Lamau, yeah, ban it. Sorry, call your mates, go outside, pick up a sport, ask a safeguarding department how they feel about the ban. We can't have kids making and sharing child pornography. It's harmful. So we don't really need to respond to that because you're sort of agreeing with us. This is the one actually that I still feel like I don't have an answer to. So it's from Jedi8526. My main issue with the social media ban is its effect on LGBTQ people, especially those from rural areas. If it wasn't for social media, I would have never known trans was an option and probably be dead. All the letters in the LGBTQ spectrum, I think, are impacted here. I do think that if you are in a group, a sort of minority group, which is potentially so small, you're unlikely to meet people in real life in your school, especially if you're in a rural area, then obviously social media can provide a bit of a lifeline.
Yeah.
I think that the preponderance of social media among young people is so severe and so damaging that I still favor the ban. But obviously, it would be good if we could find some way to keep that benefit of social media while getting rid of all the harms. And I don't know what it is.
No, I mean, look, I don't think that it means you lose nothing good. Like, there are trade-offs. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat, which is why I stopped talking.
Oh, right. I thought you suddenly just had some sort of like brain freeze.
No.
But you did have some kind of suggestion as to how we might be able to do both at the same time. You don't.
Let me
Shall I go to? I'm going to go to the next question while you sip some water. We can come back to this if you want. Right. I'm not. This is Metalhead 2550. I'm not fully opposed to a social media ban. I'm just concerned about the implications of it. All verification of people should be done locally on device. I don't trust tech bros with my data and surveillance risk. That sort of, I think Ash sort of answered that with her reference earlier to Estonia, was it? How's your voice, Ash?
A little bit better.
Oh, it's still not great though.
Yeah, it's just, you get that little...
You had something in your throat. Yeah. Do you have the... I'm saying I don't have the answer, but I'd like one.
So, again, I'm thinking about what's changed since when I was growing up. I do actually think there have been changes for the better when it comes to the acceptance of LGBT people when at school. That's changed a huge amount in a short amount of time. Not enough and not everywhere all at once, but it has.
And that might be downstream of social media, right?
I think it could be downstream of social media, also music, pop culture, anti-bullying. I mean, like the culture in this way is really different. I think there is another thing about if you don't have a sort of like open and in the light form of social media for people who are looking for forms of social connection that they can't get in real life, does that force them into more dangerous spaces? Particularly, I think, with, you know, kids who have some kind of minority identity, they're struggling to find a community of their peers. I think that's something to worry about.
I mean, I suppose what should happen is either there's a technological fix whereby you can have some form of like app or website which you can use to meet people like you that doesn't have the same addictive qualities. That might be possible. The other option would be for the government to say, look, we recognize that this has downsides, and so we're going to go sort of the extra mile to try and ameliorate those consequences, which would be saying every borough or every county is going to have a centre where young queer people can go and sort of do physical things.
No.
You announce that's going to be a problem, but go and meet people in real life, right?
Yeah.
That you could say, we recognise it's going to have some downsides, so we are going to do this extra thing.
Well, that would be like, we would have youth centres. Do you know what I mean? We'd have youth centres, and there would be provisions for queer children. I do think there's a thing which is it relentless messaging that's the problem? So is there a form of social media which has limited messaging functions? Is there a form of social media which doesn't have infinite scroll? Is there a social media which doesn't have short form videos? I think if we're in agreement that the really addictive stuff is infinite scroll, infinite messaging, short form videos, there is a version of having an availability for under 16s which protects them from those things which are just like, you know, putting their attention in a bag and smashing it to pieces with a mallet.
So I just read this. Exit. Not all kids liked it the way it was. You do realise this. We don't all want to get kicked in the shins chasing an inflated cow's belly around the field. Some of us like reading news and history. You still will be able to read news and history without social media, I would like to say. I don't know if that's because I often talk about, I used to go to a field quite a lot and drink booze on the weekend, and sort of like I speak about that in a positive way. Obviously, things can go wrong. We didn't chase cows with inflated bellies, but I imagine that's something that happens in rural areas. I hope you're not is this person getting kicked in the shins by the cow or by other kids?
I was told by my husband that cow tipping is a myth.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he grew up in a rural
slur.
area. He said
a smear on.
He said that he'd never once tipped a cow. I mean, look, in terms, again, it's like you can access news and history and learn not on the internet, which is what many of us had to do. And I actually think having to work for it a bit, having to read a whole book, it's actually good for you. And so that's the thing, which is like, yes, convenience is a good, but it's not the only good. And when you rank convenience as a good higher than all the other goods, you end up, I think, in a really fucked up place as a society.
There's someone saying football, Michael. That's how they're getting kicked in the shins by the football, but it was in direct reference to the big cow. Anyway, let's wrap up there. Ash, thank you for joining me tonight.
Look, save the kids. So I would literally rather see a toddler smoking than using an iPad. That's how I feel.
And I would prefer to see a young person kicked in the shins by a fat cow than going on Instagram. Thank you, everyone, for
I'll kick
tuning
any
in.
young person.
Don't kick young people. I don't endorse cows kicking young people. That actually sounds quite dangerous, doesn't it? Someone says, people do cow tip in America, but it's wrong. And I think most kids realise it's cruel. I do hope so. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.